Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Annette Johns, and I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Practice with the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers. I will be the moderator for today's education event, Social Work and Disability-Related Advocacy through Empower Services. We have over 150 social workers from across the province registered for this event this morning. The webinar presentation will be approximately 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A period that I will moderate. Please note that all the details you need, like how to access the slide deck and other housekeeping information, is under the announcement and housekeeping widget. All the widgets can be accessed by clicking the blue and white icons at the bottom of your window. You can also resize and move around any of the elements you see on your screen to customize your viewing experience. Throughout the presentation, I encourage you to type in your questions using the question mark icon at any time, and I will begin asking the questions at the end of the presentation. Only myself and the presenters can see the questions. I now want to introduce our speakers. Taylor is a recent graduate of Memorial University School of Social Work program and is a registered social worker. She works as a housing support worker at Empower, the Disability Resource Center, to support individuals to find and maintain safe, accessible, and affordable housing. Taylor uses a disability lens and works from a strengths-based and person-centered approaches to support clients in overcoming barriers that they face. Joby has a bachelor's degree of education and is the Advocacy Program Manager for Empower. Joby has over 20 years experience of disability advocacy in the community and received a national award from the CCD in 2000, recognizing his work with the disability community. Joby is passionate about inclusiveness and accessibility in Newfoundland and Labrador and advocates for stakeholders to look at systemic issues with a disability lens. Joby is co-chair of the Inclusive Advisory Committee and sits on the Disability Network Committee. And now, without further ado, I'll pass the virtual podium back to over to Taylor and Joby to begin the presentation.
Good morning, everybody. Empower is a nonprofit, independent living resource center. We're one of 24 locations across Canada. We're cross-disability in focus, which means that we work with people with all different types of disabilities. So that could be a person with a physical disability, a person with who's blind or deaf, a person basically with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, or mental health, for example, intellectual disability and learning disability. So it's a real spectrum in terms, and I've only named some. And we have to also understand that every disability, it may have a name, but is very different to each individual. Our building is located in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador, but we are province-wide.
Okay, and so here is our building at 4 Escazoni Place in St. John's. So Empower's vision is for Newfoundland and Labrador to be an inclusive community for all people. We envision a society that embraces diversity and the rights of all individuals to choice, self-determination, and independent living. Additionally, Empower's mandate is to ensure that individuals with disabilities have equal access to quality supports that enable and empower them to A, live and work independently and to their full potential, and B, make informed choices for themselves in all aspects of their daily lives.
Now, when we work at Empower, we work with the independent living philosophy. And you may ask what that is. It's certainly not about making everybody live on their own, but it is a philosophy that we work within that is empowering to people with disabilities. It's about the right to choice, the right to take risks and make mistakes, having control over one's life. And individuals decide the who, what, when, where, and why of any support service that they receive. The components are the same for everyone. The results will vary depending on the individual. This is our #1 slogan at Empower and within the disability community. Nothing about us without us. is a motto from the 1970s independent living movement, which we encompass into our work with every individual here at Empower. This motto demands inclusion in policy making and decision making for the disability community. In our work at Empower, we follow an autonomous, person-centered approach with every consumer that we serve.
So as shown in Empower's vision, mandate, and also the independent living philosophy, it's quite evident that Empower's core values align with those of social workers. So I'm going to chat a little bit about the similarities between the two. So one of Empower's first core values is an individual's right to choice and self-determination. So this aligns really closely with the social work value of respect for the inherent dignity and worth of persons. Upholding a person's right to self-determination is a permanent fixture in the work that we do at Empower. So we work with our consumers to advocate for their rights to make their own decisions based on voluntary and informed consent, and we want to ensure that their voices are being heard. So secondly, empowering individuals to gain and maintain control over all aspects of their lives is also one of Empower's core values. And this value aligns closely with the social work value of pursuing social justice. So this value includes trying to reduce barriers and expand choice for people, specifically those who are the most vulnerable in our community, including people with disabilities. So when we work with our consumers, we try to help them overcome the barriers that they face by advocating for change. So we work to advocate for all individuals to have access to resources, public services, and the community as a whole. So when equal access is made a priority for our consumers and the barriers are dismantled, their options become much broader. Then our consumers are able to have more control over their lives and also the choices that they make. So one of the last core values of Empower that I'm going to discuss is full inclusion for persons with disabilities. So this core value relates to the social work value of service to humanity. As we know, one of the principles under the social work value of service to humanity is to promote individual development and the pursuit of individual goals, and also the development of a just society. So in the work that we do in the advocacy program at Empower, we really try to strive to create a just society for our consumers and help them pursue their own goals. So here's a graphic that we found. We feel that the concepts of a just society and an inclusive society go hand in hand, and that, as the graphic says here, a just society and an inclusive society is a society where all people can thrive. So now I'm going to chat very briefly about some of the social work approaches that I use in my work at Empower. Annette did describe those in my bio, but I'm just going to add a little bit more detail to that now. So one of the most important approaches that we use at Empower is a person-centered approach. So we understand that each of our clients who are people with disabilities are unique. So each of them require different strategies to meet their needs. So we work with them on an individual level. We understand that consumers are the experts of their own lives. They know themselves best and they know their needs. So we meet them where they are and we work with them to help them reach their goals. So additionally, both Joby and I work from a strengths-based approach. So we support our consumers in recognizing their strengths and abilities. Our consumers are incredibly resilient and have overcome several barriers in their lives. So we work with them to determine how their strengths can assist them in overcoming further barriers that they're facing. So while working within the strengths-based approach, we're not ignoring the challenges that they're facing, but we're certainly trying to highlight their strengths while we're supporting them. And lastly, at Empower, we also work within anti-oppressive practice. So as I mentioned, we do understand that consumers and people with disabilities face inequalities in their daily lives. So we strive to challenge these inequalities by advocating at various different levels. So we work with the consumers and listen to their lived experiences of the challenges that they faced, and then we work in partnership with them to support them. So as we continue to chat a little bit about the work specifically that we do at Empower, it'll become quite evident the social work ethics, values, and approaches that we're using. So next, Joby's going to chat a little bit about the disability etiquette and language guidelines. And first, I'm just going to discuss what etiquette is. So etiquette is a code of behavior that's observed by different groups within society. It's typically concerned with politeness and respect. So just like language, which we'll touch on in a moment, our behavior often reflects our attitudes towards certain individuals. So when we're working with people with disabilities, we really want to make sure that we're using disability etiquette in order to be respectful towards them.
So to speak about the general etiquette guidelines, these are basically put together by people with disabilities and over working with people with disabilities, support of how they feel and what actually they are comfortable with. So the first thing is avoid us and them situations. You never want to be pegged against the person you're working with. And we find too many times as we're navigating different systems or as we're approaching different areas around advocacy that there is an us in terms of the person with the disability and their support, and a them in terms of often agency, whether that be healthcare or government or otherwise. So avoiding that situation where possible and working collaboratively is very important. Don't make assumptions about people. That is so important to keep in mind. Treat the person as you would anyone. And an example of that for is that if you are talking to somebody who is blind, and they say to you, "Well, did you see that show last night? It was really funny." Making a spectacle and saying, "Well, how did you see that?" Or this is that's difficult, is not really where you go. You say, "Yeah, that's a really good show. It looks like it's going to be a good season for that show," for example. Or another example is somebody who uses a wheelchair and they say, "Want to go for a walk at lunch?" Instead of saying, "Well, you can't, you're not walking, you're going to ride your wheelchair, right?" It's much easier and much better flow of conversation and socializing with somebody to say, "Sure, I'll go for a walk with you. Path looks really dry today." These are some examples around basically treating people as everyone else, and that's full inclusion. It's okay to ask a person if they would like some help, but also don't be offended if the person says no. Often people are very empowered and have found their own strategies to be able to do things in their lives. Speak in a normal tone. That's a really important one when you're working with people, for example, who may be using a wheelchair or somebody who is blind as an example. And often sometimes I've seen professionals and health professionals raise their voice to somebody with a disability. But if they have no difficulty with their hearing, there's no reason to raise your voice or to speak very, very slowly to them in a monotone voice. It just makes things more uncomfortable. Gently get the person's attention before beginning a conversation. And that's very important if you're working with, for example, somebody who's blind, somebody who may have ASD, autism spectrum disorder, somebody with PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, or somebody with an intellectual disability. It's really good to get their attention so that they're hearing what you're saying, they understand who is there with them, so everybody can feel comfortable in that conversation. Directly address the person you are talking to, not the interpreters or other support people. A great example of that, and it takes some skill, but it's very important, is if a person who is deaf or hearing impaired comes with an interpreter for American Sign Language, and you're speaking to the interpreter because that's the person who's speaking to you. But you need to understand that communication is really coming from the individual person with the disability. Also, if somebody comes with a support person or a family member and they, are a person with a disability, really important to include them in the conversation. Because we must understand, if we look at the independent living philosophy, again, they are the decision makers of their lives. Ask questions, but don't get too personal with people. Treat people exactly the way you would with other anyone else. You don't need to know more information than you're supposed to about somebody. So make sure you're asking questions within context, would be advised.
So here there's a graphic that was drawn by Cadence, who's age 8. This graphic discusses labeling a little bit. So Cadence writes on the photo, "Why do people call autism a label? I don't think that's right. My label is Cadence. One of my ingredients is autism." So in the photo, she draws tomato soup and writes the ingredients of tomato soup, and then draws herself and writes autism as one of her ingredients, along with organs, bones, blood, clever cells, and caring cells. So she's describing that although autism is a part of her, it's not her label, and there are other things that make up her personality and herself as a person.
Language is also very important when working with people with disabilities and any minority group in a lot of cases. But I'm going to give you some examples in terms of the right type of language to use that would make people most comfortable as people with disabilities, clients or consumers. We are people. First and foremost, to remember, any person with a disability is a person before their disability. Instead of disabled, handicapped, or crippled, and many other terms, it's much preferred to use a person with a disability or people with disabilities, a person who has a learning disability, a person who uses a wheelchair, not in a wheelchair, for example. First and foremost, we're people. Disability is part of who we are. We recognize it, we accept, and we own that as often who we are, and that is a very empowering way to think about disability. But it does not define who we are. And it's very important to understand that the defining of people with disabilities often is coming from the barriers that society is putting upon them. We prefer to be referred to in print or in broadcast media as people with disabilities and not the disabled. Some general language guidelines for disability: avoid us versus them language. Again, the same as etiquette. Develop a default to a person first language. As I just said, put the person always first before the disability. Avoid words like suffer or inflicted, confined to a bed, for example, in a healthcare terminology. Watch the context of challenge or struggle. People go through a lot of different things that they have to work very hard towards in order to meet goals, as people with disabilities, for example. But it's more important to be empowering to them than define basically things as challenge or struggle. Avoid language that conveys pity, like bless you or you poor thing. So many people I work with tell me every day they do not want pity. And some of the situations are pretty complex and pretty severe and pretty sad that people are living in. For example, people with disability are living in poverty. The majority of them. We see food security issues every day, but people don't want to be pitied. They want to be supported and they want to be empowered. Avoid language that put people with disabilities on a pedestal. Like, you're so brave. People want to be included as everybody else. And think about it. Would you really say that to somebody who you did not see as a person with a disability? Would you say to a colleague, for example, just, who's offering you a coffee and saying, how's your day today? Would you like to go for a coffee? You wouldn't just come out and say, you're so brave. You wouldn't even think to do that. But often we do that with people with disabilities. And one word that is very important to avoid is special. People with disabilities don't want to feel special. They want to feel included like everybody else. Another thing to understand in language is the idea of misinterpretation. Often it is actually stated as well, and I think this one's really important, is when you're working with somebody and you may have made a mistake in terms of what you've said, but if it is something that is a responsibility of yours or of anybody's, take responsibility instead of saying to the person with the disability, you misunderstood me. if you get into a difficult situation. That is one that people with disabilities find very insulting, and it can really change the interaction and your working relationship with somebody.
So I'm just going to explain a little bit about the advocacy program team here at Empower. So as you know, Joby Fleming is the advocacy program manager at Empower. Another part of the team is we have an advocacy assistant. So Sharon Hogan is our advocacy assistant who works really closely with us and also with our consumers to support them. I'm the housing support worker here at Empower. This position began in January of 2021 as a new addition to the advocacy team. Additionally, the advocacy team typically has 1 to 2 social work students. So Joby has had a collaboration with Memorial University's School of Social Work for quite some time now. He's been taking a social work student and being a mentor for them for quite a few years. And just recently, we've begun taking 2 students. So I'm also a mentor with the School of Social Work starting this previous September. So we're really glad to have that collaboration with the School of Social Work and have students as a part of our team. So here we have a bar graph that is showing the number of contacts related to advocacy services and how it's changed in the past couple of years. So the statistics we take are the number of contacts that we put out. So the people we are contacting, whether this be consumers, community partners or government partners, also health professionals or family members. So anybody that we're contacting in the work that we do, we document that as a statistic. And as you can see, it's increased immensely from the 2019 to 2020 reporting period and then to the 2020 to 2021 period. So the advocacy program might seem to be pretty small, but we are definitely making a lot of contacts and supporting a lot of consumers.
Advocacy Services. This is the program that I manage and that my team supports with. We support consumers as they navigate through different systems in our province, and it's really important to keep in mind that that is very difficult for consumers, for clients to do. It becomes more complex trying to find the right person to talk to, and often sometimes it can be a challenge and take a long time for us in an advocacy effort as well. We provide consumers with different options for breaking through barriers inherent within these systems as well. And there are many things like restrictive policies, for example, is certainly one that we work within. And as times, we go into austerity, sometimes there's more restrictions that are there, and certainly with COVID as well. We provide consumers with the opportunity to build on their skills that would help them become an effective self-advocate. We do that through role modeling. They basically watch us support them, and then they find out how to advocate for themselves in an effective manner. We guide consumers in making their own decisions. As we said, it's their decisions. We just give them all the information that we possibly can. Supporting consumers in building self-confidence is also very important, because to be an effective self-advocate, you need to have self-confidence as well. We can support consumers with accessing mental health services, and we have to do a lot of that, we find. We're very much involved in trying to connect people with mental health services in Newfoundland and Labrador. We provide supportive counseling to people. Often that's a very important thing, and people really trust us here at Empower. They often say it's a home away from home when they used to come in person prior to the COVID, and they still do when they come for appointments. There has to be an understanding that trust in community is built for a long period of time. And often for that reason, there is a great collaboration between us and government agencies and healthcare agencies as well that people are maybe working with, because we spend a lot more time with people when we really get to know them and have the ability to do that. We are also involved in crisis intervention. Part of that trust comes when people are in trouble, when people feel that they are really of need of urgent support. And often that crisis intervention is for mental health. It's people with suicidal ideation, as well as people who state that they have a plan around suicide, people who are in poverty or people who are evicted, people who find themselves really at the worst point in their life will often come to us. So we do have to seek out supports, certainly in terms of mental health supports, mental health crisis supports, in terms of the mental health crisis line, as well as the mobile crisis unit. We work closely with them when we have a consumer that is in crisis, and in other areas, certainly like the shelter line for people who find themselves homeless. We support people with various assessments, including home support assessments in the home, as well as any other assessments that may be necessary. Another one certainly would be paratransit eligibility assessments as well in the City of St. John's. We help people fill out applications for things like housing, income support, MCP, prescription drug programs, many different kinds. As well, we provide food security. And in the last year, we've provided $70,000 in food security and gift cards, thanks to a partnership with the federal government under COVID relief funding. We also provide and work within individual advocacy as well as systemic advocacy. Individual is certainly within the individual clients that we serve, but when we see patterns, and we see many in areas of accessible housing, poverty in with people with disabilities, for example, and mental health barriers, we definitely work within a systemic model to provide systemic advocacy and speak to the decision makers around changing policy that affects and will empower people with disabilities. Knowing what you want and need is very important as a skill. And we try to tell people that, for example, when they're using advocacy skills, that these are toolbox. They have a toolbox and these are some of the tools that are in them. So these are some of the skills that we teach people in terms of the advocacy skills. So, making a goal, what do you actually need? What are you advocating for? And trying to really make that specific and narrow that down. Prioritizing issues. People often come with many issues to us, and we have to sometimes prioritize what is most important to them at that point in time. Knowing their rights is very important, and we certainly work within the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the idea of human rights for people with disabilities, and we believe that that needs to be upheld. The idea of duty to accommodate and the right to accommodation. Communicating well is very important. So making sure that we try to take the emotion out of the equation, basically, when we're working with, when somebody is advocating and when we're advocating with them, so that we can try to have their voice heard, making sure that that's a priority for us, and making sure that their points come across in terms of what they're trying to advocate for, that they're able to communicate. Problem solving, very important with the inherent barriers that we see in front of them. And knowing how to assert oneself is also very important. So we teach the differences of behaviors between passive, assertive, and aggressive, and making sure we're in between in the assertive realm, instead of either being passive, walked over, people basically making decisions in your life for you, or aggressive, where often emotionally charged is a part of that. So why do we need advocates? Sometimes people don't know where to go to get help. They don't know how to navigate the services. And the other thing too that's important to keep in mind is a lot of people who do come and see us, I would say about 80 to 85% of people who come and see us have tried to advocate, are very good advocates, have advocated to help others. But when you get the answer of no on the phone or in an email or in person from someone from the other side, in terms of an agency or any of those kind of things, where do you go? That's a very, very backed into a corner, closed answer. There's no openness for discussion. There's no openness for trying to listen to someone's side when you hear no. So we don't make the decisions. We know that there's decision makers. but we make sure that there's a reason why the decision is made and that that is given to the client that we work with. Sometimes people can't speak for themselves, and that could be physically to do with their disability, or that could be because they've been so downtrodden that they are so afraid of retaliation and rejection that they really need the support for someone to do that for them. Often comes to mind mental health, which is a comorbidity for us with other types of disabilities and often increased because of the inherent barriers that people are facing. They need someone to be in their corner. They need someone to be able to speak for them. And we do that certainly with consent and informed consent. Sometimes people aren't being listened to. That is another thing that we find, and that is certainly an area where we work in awareness and educating people that people with disabilities are people, as we said, so they need the support and they deserve to be heard.
So some of the top issues that consumers had come to the advocacy program for in our most recent reporting year of 2020 to 2021 was the top issue was mental health. This doesn't come as a surprise to us because, as we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has been ongoing, and this has caused a lot of issues for the mental well-being of a lot of people, not only people with disabilities, but we have noticed that a lot of people who are coming to Empower for services, whether primarily for accessing mental health services or for other things, that mental health is often an issue that's discussed with us. So one of the other top issues that people come to the advocacy program for is housing. So prior to the housing support worker position being at Empower, again, I mentioned started in January 2021, Joby was supporting people with Empower, supporting people with housing within the advocacy program. But since the housing support worker has come on, there's been definitely an uptake of more housing services we're able to provide. So again, we're not surprised that housing has been a top issue within this reporting period. So some other issues that people are coming to the advocacy program for is financial, so income support as well. As Joey mentioned, a lot of our consumers and people with disabilities are living in poverty. So we're helping them navigate that and, you know, referring to other resources for food security. We are providing our own food security, and then we're also helping them navigate the income support system. So home support is another major issue people have come to the advocacy program about, whether that be help with their home support assessments and wanting an advocate to be with them in that, or helping them, you know, navigate with their case managers to ensure that their needs are being met. And some other issues that people come to the advocacy program for are accessibility and accommodations, transportation, and legislation and policy, just to name a few. So I'm going to chat a little bit about my role in the housing services that we provide at Empower. So my position started in January of 2021 through funding with End Homelessness St. John's. And my main role is to support people who are at imminent risk of or are experiencing homelessness. And I provide support to these individuals with various housing related matters, with the main goal of helping them find and maintain safe, affordable, and accessible housing. So supporting consumers with housing, there's a lot of different things that need to be done with that. So I certainly support consumers with trying to prevent evictions. So if consumers come to us with an eviction notice, I try to support them in keeping them in their current housing arrangement by liaising with their landlords and trying to help them out in that situation. If that's not possible to keep them in that housing arrangement, then I do support consumers with trying to find additional alternative living arrangements. So this would include helping them with an apartment search. So actually helping them search for an apartment that might be suitable to their needs. I'm also able to provide consumers with transportation to and from apartment viewings. We found that's a barrier that a lot of people are facing in accessing housing is actually getting to an apartment to view. So we've been able to reduce that barrier by providing that support. Additionally, I'm able to support them throughout the tenancy and liaising with their landlords to try to make them the most successful they can be. So I help consumers navigate the Residential Tenancies Act to ensure that they know their rights as a tenant and know kind of what they need to do in order to be successful in their tenancy. Some other things that I do as a housing support worker is assist consumers in applying for Newfoundland Labrador housing or St. John's affordable housing, and also helping them liaise with the income support system. So whether that be helping them apply for income support to ensure that they have an income to secure housing, or helping them send in their rental agreement and ensure that their landlord's banking information is in so that the rent is paid. So we certainly help them with whatever it is they may need related to their housing. So one other thing that Joby and I do in relation to housing at Empower is we attend the Coordinated Access to Homes Resource Allocation Table. This is with End Homelessness St. John's and community partners. So we attend this table and we work with lots of partners in our community to collaborate to house the most vulnerable people who are at imminent risk or are experiencing homelessness in St. John's. So since I started this position in January, there's certainly been some barriers to housing that I've noticed, most specifically in St. John's, as this is where the majority of my work has been. One major barrier is the availability of housing in the current market. So right now, the housing market in St. John's is a pretty competitive one. There aren't a lot of apartments available, which means there's a lot of people looking and a lot of people applying for apartments, which then makes it more difficult for our consumers to secure suitable living arrangements. So one thing that comes with that is obtaining references. So because of the competitiveness in the rental market right now, most landlords who may not have previously asked for references are now asking for references. And that they might ask for 2 or 3 references, which can often be difficult for our consumers to obtain, when some of them have previously gotten evicted, or some of them just might not have a lot of support or might not have a long rental history to have those references. So we certainly work with them to try to navigate these barriers that they face to the best of our abilities. Another barrier that we see here in St. John's is the availability of accessible housing. So finding wheelchair accessible housing, or like fully wheelchair accessible or even partially accessible, is incredibly difficult. There isn't a lot of it around, and the accessible housing that does exist is quite expensive. So it's not usually in the financial means of our consumers, who are mostly on fixed incomes. So that leads into the financial barriers that our consumers face is, again, because of the competitiveness in the rental market, the rates of rent are incredibly high right now. So it's very difficult to find something that is affordable for our consumers. And a lot of our consumers are finding themselves in poverty and, struggling to make ends meet because they need to pay their rent. So once the rent is paid, they may struggle to then pay their heat and light bill or pay for food. So the finances is definitely a barrier that we see. And one of the last barriers that we see is access to other resources. So as we know, housing somebody and making sure they're successful in their housing takes a lot more than just putting a roof over somebody's head. So people often need various other resources, obviously different for each individual, but sometimes it can be really difficult to actually access what they need, whether that be mental health services or sufficient home support to meet their needs. So there's a lot of resources that we try to work with consumers to help them navigate and help them get access to the resources they need to be successful in their tenancies.
So I just want to take a moment and talk to you about our referral process to the advocacy program here at Empower. First and foremost, we work within a confidential environment. So everything we do is around consent forms, and it is around basically making sure that we uphold people's privacy and share only the information that is necessary for them in terms of to support them. The referral process at Empower is very open and low barrier, which we commend ourselves on, and we pride ourselves to be able to do that in order to accommodate everyone's individual needs. So we don't have a strict criteria. Where we're cross disability, we work also within every age group. So we work with, for example, children as dependents with families, as well as adults, as well as with the senior population as well. And we're seeing in the demographics that more people with disabilities, more seniors are aging into disability as well in a lot of cases. Empower does not have a formal referral process. We do, though, do an intake once we meet with people, or we can do that by phone, certainly, and send out a consent form as well. And we do work in consult with professionals who may be making referrals with us. And in a lot of cases, what's really important to us as well is that we're working with somebody. So it's not about basically referring to us and we take over. In some cases we will, in terms of a advocacy effort, but we very much like to work collaboratively with other community partners or with other government agencies. And often we work very closely with social workers. It's probably one of the main professions that we work with on a daily basis in the advocacy program is social workers around the province and in different areas. These referrals can be done through phone, email, over Zoom, for example, or other media platforms for communication, or through in-person appointments, either here at Empower or at another organization or in someone's home. We really try to meet people where they're to, both emotionally to support them as well as physically. Once we receive a referral, our advocacy assistant will contact the consumer to set up an appointment. It takes about sometimes 2 weeks to get in to see me, about a week or so to get in to see Taylor for housing on average. Then we will meet with the consumer, complete consent forms and an intake form, and determine how we can support the consumer going forward. And again, we work within a cross disability, so there's no type of disability we will not work with in terms of an individual. And we don't believe in the word necessarily complex. We realize that there are a lot of issues that people may come with, and that needs to be sorted, but we truly see complex as people with disabilities in most cases. And we'll often partner with other community organizations. We often do that and work with them to be able to support an individual. So we provide primary support or secondary support in a lot of cases. And we truly believe that a warm handover is very helpful as well. If it is a handover, that sometimes that comes with another professional, or that a professional has that conversation with someone before we make a call often, but we will make a cold call when we see urgency or it be necessary. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about our other programs and services here at Empower. We've spoken at length about the advocacy services, and certainly here to talk one-on-one with anybody about that at any point in time. We welcome that. Housing support as well, Taylor has gone into detail around her work. But we also have peer support. Peer support is a very powerful way basically to support people. And it's about them supporting each other and us basically facilitating that process. We're very happy that we were able to do that in person with people prior to the pandemic. We would hold a craft group, for example, every Thursday afternoon. And it wasn't about adults doing crafts, which we were often questioned about, but it was about basically people coming together around that craft that they may be doing around a season, for example, like pumpkin carving at Halloween, or making a Christmas crafts. But it was about them coming together. And some of our consumers often said, a lot of them said to us, this is the only bit of socialization I get in the run of a week. Their way of saying that, Joby, this is the only time I get out in the run of a week. And that's really important to us that we're able to provide that. It was so important that when the pandemic came and the lockdowns came, we knew we wanted to be safe first and foremost for our consumers. So we pivoted all of our services online, and we became essential services, certainly within the advocacy program and within some of the others as well. Some of our peer support groups, I've mentioned craft group. We have a men's and women's group individually and a women's group individually, so they can talk about their issues. And often we bring them forward for different sessions or consultations or focus groups around different issues as well. Employment supports and services. Inclusion NL is the department that operates the program. Kathy Hawkins is the manager, and it's about developing a business confidence with businesses around them being confident to hire more people with disabilities. And it's also making sure that events and programs are fully inclusive for people with all types of disabilities. We offer technology services in the area of adaptive technology, where we work with different devices around technology. We also will work one-on-one with individuals to make their technology work for them. We offer an IL internship program where we're giving people the chance for employment to basically start working with us as their starting point into employment. They also become ambassadors in their different areas. So we have about 7 to 9 interns around the province, and they bring the different areas, the different issues, in the province to us. And they also bring referrals to us as well, where we can help individuals. They are true ambassadors. Our volunteer services have certainly been put a little bit on the suspended and on the back burner due to COVID-19. We had to certainly suspend that. But before that, and hopefully after, we have volunteers answering our phones. So it's the first friendly voice that you hear when you call Empower, often is a person with a disability themselves who really is empowered to be here. Career services. On the other side, we're building business confidence, but on the other side of this as well, we're working one-on-one with our individuals. And we have an employment coordinator who works with individuals with disabilities in terms of resume building, preparing people for interview preparation, and also helping to accommodate them in the workplace as well.
So here we just have a graphic that we think really describes some of the important pieces of advocacy. So some of the words that you see here is people and rights, and views, choices, also vulnerable and access and services. So I think some of these words are things that we really try to do at Empower in the advocacy program is provide access and services to our consumers who are some of the most vulnerable people in our community, and to really uphold their rights to self-determination and their rights to choice. So that clues up our presentation. Here is the contact information for both Joby and I. We're certainly open to any questions that you guys may have.
Okay. Thank you so much, Taylor and Joby, for this excellent presentation. So we have arrived at our question and answer period, and we do have some questions coming in, and we have lots of time. So people who are attending online, feel free to send in your questions. But one of the questions we did receive is someone is wondering if you can describe more about your advocacy on a systems level. For example, lack of accessibility for all at the pedestrian mall, many businesses, Mall 1, etc. So if you could speak a little bit more about the broader system.
Sure. So that's for systemic advocacy. As in my bio, it states that I am the co-chair of the Inclusion Advisory Committee and have sat on the Inclusion Advisory Committee for many years and led the committee as well. So that's where, in terms of the pedestrian mall, we were heavily involved in working around making that as accessible as it possibly could be with the city. For example, we put in a 2-meter sidewalk recommendation to the city that they approved this year, so that people with physical disabilities could go on the sidewalk basically as 2 people in a wheelchair, even in terms of amount of space that using a wheelchair that was afforded to them. We made sure that other things were accessible. We trained the business community, did training. We also did it with the security in order to make sure that they could answer questions for people with disabilities, making sure there was blue zone drop-offs, certainly, and parking outside of the pedestrian mall, but very close in vicinity. And, there's still a lot of work to do in that. We are in the oldest city in North America, in St. John's, for example. So we are still working around things like the full accessibility of buildings. And this is something that we believe is going to come with the disability statute once the provincial government brings that in, which is a mandate of the government right now as well. And we're working very closely around working with ministers and working with government to bring as much accessibility as possible there. In terms of mile one, you may mention, for example, we work with people to help them access the attendant pass so that they can have inclusion and have a worker come with them to be able to attend events. And the idea of the attendant pass is once approved by Inclusive Services, for example, with the City of St. John's, and we put in an application for that, their attendant is able to get in free to be able to provide support to them. So they're empowered to be able to go to different events and be fully included like everybody else as well. So systemic issues is something that we're working on. You know, the built environment, one area certainly, as we've just spoken about in some of those, but also looking systemically around, you know, the poverty reduction. You know, we've brought in and we're able to provide food security and these type of programs, for example, during the pandemic. But nothing says after COVID, and certainly before COVID, that these are not necessary to continue. So we're certainly advocating around poverty for people with disabilities as well, along with many other areas. Accessible housing being a huge one, as Taylor mentioned as well.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple questions that are kind of themed around the same question. I know you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that you were provincial, and that was a question that came in. Someone had joined a little bit late, but also people are wondering if you do provide housing supports outside of St. John's, and do you have satellite offices throughout the province? Like, how are you able to provide provincial outreach?
We don't have satellite offices. We're a small but mighty organization in terms of what we're able to provide from St. John's. Certainly in pivoting more virtually, we have provided more services outside of the city, but our capacity in terms of funding as a community organization and as a nonprofit does not leave us the ability to be able to go on tour basically and work with people heavily in other parts of the province. Inclusion NL does a little bit more of that in terms of their funding, but we certainly are advocating to government to expand the advocacy program, and we feel it definitely necessary. As Taylor showed in our small stats that we just gave you a glimpse of in terms of in this presentation, that our demand is certainly increasing on a daily basis. I would say not even monthly, but truly daily. A number of calls and concerns come in, and they're very serious in nature in terms of what people are looking for support. So in those areas, we certainly do work provincially. We would work provincially with the health authorities, for example, or with the government departments in breaking down barriers, and with families as well. But we can't get to them to meet them where they're to as easily as we are on the Avalon. Taylor, did you want to talk about our housing in terms of providing?
Yeah, so I guess, like as Joey mentioned, based on some funding limitations, certainly I'm supporting people in the Avalon with like apartment viewings and stuff like that. And because we don't have a satellite office, we wouldn't really have the capacity to be able to do that outside of the Avalon. Certainly, if people have I have supported individuals as far as Carboneer in terms of like over the phone and supporting with like income support processes and contacting a landlord and stuff like that. But it really depended on the fact that, the landlord had the ability to send me the rental agreement for us to have a look at and stuff like that. So it really depends on the situation, but most of our housing services specifically are within the St. John's area. Definitely due to the funding constraints and not having a satellite office for sure.
Okay, thank you. Coming back to slide 17, I'll just push it through here around the increase that you're seeing. What do you think might be attributing to some of that increase over the past year from 2019, 2020 to 2020, 2021? Are you getting a sense of what's promoting that?
Yes, we are in a lot of cases. I mean, we can only say COVID for so long in terms of answering questions. I truly believe because these were here prior to COVID, and they will be here after if we don't do something. I truly believe a lot of the systems are truly under major capacity and at their end of their capacity levels in some cases. Housing, every shelter in St. John's is full. So there's nowhere to go in a lot of cases, and a lot of them are not accessible in terms of housing. We need to build more affordable, accessible housing in that area, for example. In healthcare, we all know the major issues that are coming. We know the Health Accord is certainly looking at that. But we presented, even as of yesterday, to the Health Accord around issues like home support. Our home support system is in crisis in two different areas. One, in austerity, we are cutting hours. People are having their hours, but cutting hours are being cut by health authorities in a lot of cases in terms of what is realistic to meet people's needs, in terms of what we're hearing from our consumers. On the other side, there's a true shortage around agencies being able to find workers. So, there are a lot of areas, and more we're finding people are in poverty. As we're finding it difficult, as professionals, I'm sure we get sticker shock in terms of how much something costs. I mean, for example, I think a pack of bacon is $25 for a pre-cooked pack of bacon at Costco. I mean, that certainly showed me inflation pretty quick, and I'm not in that area, but we know that things are getting harder for people to be able to pay. And we have to understand that in income support, for example, rent is the first thing that's paid. So you can have a dietary allowance, you can have many different other things that are in there in your income. But if your rent is so high, then it truly is that we're seeing consumers basically being able to make decisions between heat and light and food and medication. And we see that every day in terms of where our consumers are too. So COVID is part of it, but it's certainly in terms of austerity in this province of where we're going and how systems are, services are being cut and barriers are being put up, including restrictive policies that are affecting things. Portable rent subsidies, for example, someone to be able to move out of somewhere that is unsafe for them or not accessible for them is difficult to find. So there's a lot of challenges that are put up in front of people that they have no other choice but to come to a support to be able to work through and navigate through those challenges.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I'm following on the heels of that question. Someone is wondering, can you speak more about your advocacy in relation to legislation and policy?
We're involved basically through the Disability Network in meeting with government departments around policy and legislation. The legislation being looked at right now, obviously, is the Disability Act in terms of the statute that is under the offices of Minister John Abbott, the minister responsible for the status of persons with disabilities. So those are certainly areas that we're looking at currently in terms of looking as it comes forward, and we'll be consulting in those areas. But we look at all different levels of government as well. We are involved in the inclusion committee, certainly for the city of St. John's, where we're looking at many different things to make things inclusive. And we also get involved and have gotten involved in some of the COVID policies that have come down. One of which that we worked very hard around was people with mental health certifications in terms of being certified in hospital were not allowed a support person. And we felt in terms of when we look at decision making, that was an exemption in the health authorities, but they never looked at a support person for somebody certified, which means you are having difficulty making decisions that are safe in your life. We thought that was unfair, and we worked very hard with Eastern Health and very happy, for example, with also the Department of Health to have that restriction removed for anybody during the lockdown period where no visitors were allowed. So that was certainly a piece of policy that we were able to look at. We've also looked at policies around camps in the summertime, and having, there was a policy put in place that you'd have to pay a worker to come in to provide personal care for a child in a day camp. We were able to explain and have that policy changed that a family member was able to come in and do that on a lunch hour, for example, to be able to allow that full inclusion for that child to be able to come to that camp. But we work very closely, for example, with the Disability Policy Office in the Disability Network of community organizations, working closely with them in terms of looking at policy every day as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We have another question from someone who's just curious about how you were able to access the food security program through the COVID relief funding. And is this something that you're able to share in terms of the process that you took for that, as the person notes, there are many individuals that we can assist that could avail of food security?
That was more our executive director during COVID, but the Prime Minister did put out announcements in the beginning, I guess a month or two into the lockdowns across the country, that United Way and other organizations basically would be involved in bringing funding, I guess, to the provinces, different community groups that could apply for it, those kind of things. And food security was one that we saw very quickly as an area, because one of the things that we saw was that the food banks shut down very, very quickly, because a lot of the workers in food banks, for example, are elderly, are seniors, and they were, one of the main targets around COVID, around protection and protecting them. So when they shut down, there was nothing there in a lot of cases. So we were able to basically provide that in a contactless drop-off form for them. And we also had other private sector basically come forward and want to work with us in providing food hampers, and certainly did on 2 occasions. We provided some pretty heavy food hampers to people around toiletries, as well as food products to them in different areas, and trying to look at healthy. Because one of the things that's really important around food security for us is that, we can have people, who are told by health professionals, for example, you have to eat healthy. For example, if you're diabetic, then you need your 3 meals a day and your snacks in order to regulate your blood sugars. But what's important to keep in mind is that somebody can't afford to do that. They really can't afford to eat anything more than the canned food. Or are they being provided that in a food bank? So, we're asking them to eat healthy, telling them that it's medically necessary, but then not receiving any kind of support for them to be able to do that. And I mean, our food security program has closed. It's something we managed, as I said, 70,000 in the last year of what we were able to provide from September to September. But now we are basically looking to other organizations in that area, like Food First NL, to be able to provide and refer people basically for what food programs are still left, and helping as well support them in getting them to the food banks, and hopefully receiving something that they can consider healthy for them. But it's something we've brought forward to the Health Accord as well as a huge problem, and certainly to poverty reduction as well, in terms of to be looked at being built into that strategy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. We did have a comment come in on that particular point that someone just wanted to add. So it was a good point. Now that many of the programs are winding down, people are still able to access the Community Food Helpline, which is able to provide supplemental assistance through delivery of food hampers, grocery cards, or prepared meals. So that's another great resource that someone just wanted to highlight around food security. Another question that we had, someone noted a great presentation. Empower is such an invaluable resource. The question was if individuals who have been diagnosed with an intellectual disability and the barriers they experience, for example, in accessing mental health, are things there that we need to keep in mind as social workers.
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it's an area of advocacy that I do work within and have advocated pretty strongly to decision makers in Eastern Health around, is that, we can't say that people with intellectual disabilities cannot receive mental health support. We have consumers, for example, with intellectual disabilities with diagnosed, bipolar and other types of disabilities, for example. And we're finding that it's a struggle in terms of them, receiving home support, retaining home support, being able to live in their homes safely and, with support. So when we look to, I guess the beginning stages of intake around mental health, we have gotten the same answer, which is people with intellectual disabilities are not able to receive counseling because of their ability to process. However, I ask a question back in terms of that I'm providing supportive counseling and my team here and in other community organizations to those people every single day. So if we can do it and we are not trained and that is not within our scope to provide mental health treatment, so, why can't they? And we find it difficult to accept the answer that they're not able to when we're doing it in community. It is something that is still challenging, but it is something that, in a collaborative way and in a networking approach, basically, I'm working with the decision makers from a community perspective to advocate for that, because I think that has to change in a lot of ways, because you can't really distinguish between the behaviors of an intellectual disability often, from my experience, and the mental health. We have to look holistically at a person, and that's really what I'm bringing forward as the argument.
Okay, thank you. Another person, just following up on a comment that you had made, they noted that you mentioned about individuals having home supports limited or revoked, and they're wondering if you've had any discussions with government around the existing home support services guidelines.
It is something that I have presented to the implementation committee around the provincial home support program that was in place prior to COVID-19. It's something that I am constantly advocating around, that we bring more consistency around the province to home support, because that's not there. I would argue that it's not even there within the same health authorities in a lot of cases of how people are being treated and what their needs are being considered. I'll give you an example. I mean, we have consumers with comorbidities that are receiving 2 hours of home support a day. One, we can't even meet someone's needs with that. And secondly, we can't find home support to do that. And the realism is that, yes, we don't want to, give in necessarily, or government don't want to give in to home support agencies saying, well, we can't find anybody, so we're not putting anybody in terms of funding for that. But the other side of that, what we must realize is the reality that if we do not actually provide home support hours that are realistic to the hours to be able to get work done, then we are not going to have anybody for these individuals. And I can tell you, home support is a lot cheaper than $1,800 a night hospital stays. Mm-hmm. Because in a lot of cases, if some of my consumers with a lot of complex needs come to me and actually say, I have nobody, the only thing I'm able to do that is safe and ethical is tell them to call 911 to go to a hospital. And that admission can be quite long if we're not able to actually secure the home support. So we need to change some of these things. One of the other things that needs to be changed is people who still wish to live in community and be empowered. Long-term care is not always the answer for that. So our consumers say that they're concerned about. The idea of assisted living needs to be more looked at as well, to be able to provide more consistency for that individual and more support than they're able to get in the home, based on the hours that we're able to get approved for them. So those are some areas certainly we're in and looking at. And we're also meeting and happy to collaborate and partner with Eastern Health and the directors of the different community support programs to be able to explain the part and hear the voice of the consumers, because that's so important in the policy and decision making. The lived experience is second to none. I always tell our consumers that you are the experts. And when they hear that they're an expert in something, they're absolutely shocked I'm using that language, but I truly believe that it is them that we need to listen to. They need to be a part of the decision making.
Absolutely. Great response there. We do have another question, and I think maybe Taylor, this one's for you. Are you getting many calls regarding seniors looking for affordable housing in rural areas? And if so, what strategic long-term strategies have you been working on with local government and counterparts such as the Newfoundland Labrador Housing Corporation?
So I guess first off, are we getting a lot of calls from seniors in rural areas? Not really, I guess. A lot of our calls are in the Avalon region. So that's not a lot that I have been working with. And certainly the housing is a really new aspect to Empower, to actually have a specific housing role here and a housing support worker. So we're certainly, we work with Newfoundland Labrador Housing and End Homelessness St. John's every week at the coordinated access table in regards to ending homelessness, specifically here in the city from the End Homelessness St. John's funding and their priorities. So Joby, I don't know if there's anything you want to comment on in terms of
Yeah,
in the rural areas.
we partner with often, Seniors NL, obviously, in terms of providing resources, as well with Connections for Seniors. So often for seniors issues, we will often work as secondary support, and primary will go to the Connections for Seniors, who may see more of that. We find that more of the issues of people who don't have support within family or within community is really here in the city in a lot of cases. And we often hear from people that say, my neighbors help me out, or they drop off a meal to me, more in the rural areas than here in St. John's. It's kind of like people with disabilities are really supported by the whole community in some cases. In some of the rural areas we have found, I'm not saying they don't need support, because they certainly do, but that's there more than it is here in St. John's, where someone could literally be left alone with no support for days if home support is not able to be provided. And we often work with a lot of people as well. I think it's important to consider in housing and in other areas where they have nobody. They really only have us, which is a high level of responsibility on us that we take very seriously. But that they really don't. It's a misconception to think that people with disabilities have a load of people supporting them, or a huge circle of a network around them, because that's often not the case. So I hope that answers the question for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. My goodness, some great questions coming in. We're getting down on our time, but we still have a little bit of time for some more questions. So feel free to send more in. People are saying thank you, wonderful presentation. So that's always good feedback to hear too, Joby and Taylor.
Thank you.
In terms of another question is pertaining to the technology. What were some of the things you did with regards to technology to provide or to continue to provide services during COVID?
So we actually, not only food security, but we applied for funding and were successful in receiving funding to actually buy devices for people. So we actually provided Chromebooks for people and helped set them up so that they were not isolated during a pandemic. During the pandemic, in terms of from our programming to be able to access us, to be able to access a doctor, for example, or mental health groups that they may be a part of. Or to be able to communicate with family that they may have, or friends. So that's one of the things that we did very quickly. Another thing we found is that there was a lot of people, due to poverty, that don't even have a phone. And we didn't feel that was safe. In order, for us to be able to communicate with them was very important, to be able to provide service and see what their needs were, to be able to meet those in an essential way. So we also provided phones, cell phones, flip phones, if people weren't technologically really advanced, and also smartphones to people. And they still keep these devices, so they weren't on loan. Each of those individuals have those devices. We even bought and provided iPads to people. For example, if there was adaptive technology that could be put on them, that could help them further advance, making them more independent and empowered. And it's Jim Escott is our adaptive technology facilitator here at Empower, certainly able to work with anybody around and do every day in terms of technology for them as individuals, children or adults going to school, for example, and looking at technology for them. Also for businesses, right from the federal government to small businesses and within community. So people are able to have accommodations with technology, such as screen readers, speech to text or text to speech, which would be the screen reader, is big ones. Zoom text, for example. This is out of my realm a little bit. Certainly, this is Jim's area. But if you call Empower and if you have any questions around technology, Jim would be happy to get in touch with you. Or if you wish to email him, it's just Jim, Jim, at empowernl.ca. The same as mine, only Jim instead of Joby or Taylor. We're pretty easy to access that way. And our website is empowernl.ca as well, where you can certainly find all of our programming. Reach out if there's any issues around programming or technology there that he could be of service or help with.
Wow, that's wonderful. Such a great resource that you're able to provide to consumers during COVID. Fabulous. This is more of a tech question or related to slideshows. Someone is wondering if they're able to share the slideshow with their colleagues. Would you be okay with that?
For sure. I believe you have the webinar basically goes up on your channel. You said Annette anyway. So yeah,
yes.
We're happy. It's public information for sure. And we're happy to do that. Certainly feel free to do that. And if anyone has any questions, my contact information is certainly there as well. And we're happy to work with anyone for sure.
Yeah. Yes, and the PDF of the slides is in your download resource section on the webinar platform. So if you go into that section, you can certainly have a PDF of the slides as well. And yes, we are going to be putting this presentation up on our YouTube channel, so the NLCSW YouTube channel, probably in the next week once we download the file and get it up, looking at early next week. But you can certainly check on our YouTube channel for when that becomes available there as well. So we are almost out of time. So again, we've got time for a couple more questions. If there's anything you're thinking about before we adjourn for the day. And Joby and Taylor, this question had rose earlier as you were looking at the presentation around the use of identity first language. I know you talk about the person first language, which is so important. What are your thoughts around identity first language and using identity first language?
We really believe that at Empower, however someone wishes to self-identify, we respect. For example, you've heard interchangeably through the presentation me say consumer, which a lot of our membership like that term because they don't want to be seen as a client where someone is making decisions for them. It's a empowered term that goes along with the independent living philosophy, if people were wondering, or client, for example. So, but more importantly, as people. So when we look at anyone as a person, you can have person first language, but we talked about the idea of ownership and owning a disability. And often we have a lot of people, for example, who will identify as I'm dyslexic. And that's fine too. We are comfortable with empowering people in a way that they feel comfortable. So if they want to embrace and celebrate that, that their identity is that they are a person who is dyslexic, or a person who is, obviously blind, I'm blind, instead of I'm a person who's blind, we totally respect that. And not only do we respect that, but we celebrate that because that shows us empowerment of people with disabilities. And I think that's very important. It's part of the idea of making them the expert in every service they receive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a good way of framing that, Joby, in terms of empowering people, self-determination, going back to the principles that, Taylor outlined around, that those principles that you uphold, not only in social work, but also at Empower in terms of people's choice and those kinds of things. So, yeah, that's excellent. Thank you so much for that. So I'm just checking through the questions. I don't see anything else coming up there now. So I guess we'll look at ending. But I do want to thank Taylor and Joby for this wonderful presentation, and people have been saying those comments throughout that I shared. And for sharing your knowledge and experience in disability-related advocacy through Empower and on disability etiquette. Empower is such a wonderful community resource, and we hope that this presentation has provided you with new information that you can integrate into your practice. And I think maybe you'll get some more calls and referrals following the presentation this morning. And I also want to highlight that in January of 2021 edition of Connecting Voices, we also published an article on Empower in our newsletter. So if you haven't read it yet, you can access it on the NLCSW website under Practice Resources. And the NLCSW continues to develop resources and host education sessions like today's that really looks at fostering diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you can also review the NLCSW standards for cultural competence in social work practice, which fits with this focus. And that's you can access that document on the NLCSW website under Practice Resources. The PDF of the PowerPoint presentation, as I said earlier, is available in the resource section of the platform, and members may claim 1.5 CPE credits under the required category of workshops as per the NLCSW CPE policy for attending the webinar this morning. And we also ask that you complete the evaluation survey questions that will appear on your screen, because your feedback is always so greatly appreciated. And I don't know if Joby and Taylor, you had any closing thoughts that you wanted to say before we end?
Taylor, do you have anything?
I don't think so, not really. Just thank you everyone for attending. It's been a pleasure to be able to present the services that we provide at Empower to all of you.
And just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to the college, and we look forward to our continued work with the social work profession in Newfoundland and Labrador.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Joby and Taylor. It was wonderful planning this session with you, and it was and this was an initiative that came up from our promotion committee. We're always looking at ideas and topics for sessions, and one of our committee members, certainly recommended Empower and reached out to you both to do this session. So that's wonderful. These sessions wouldn't be possible without the involvement of our social workers and partners who are able to freely come and share their knowledge and experience and expertise. So once again, thank you everyone for attending. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.